Hello and welcome both to my co-host, Rob, and I guess to our listeners. How's things on your end, Rob?
All good, Rob. So pretty excited. Our first episode on the Learning Zone podcast, and something that we have been excited about and have been thinking through for almost a year now. And in consultation with a number of our clients, they've asked, when are you going to start sharing some of the stuff you share with us and create a space where we can engage with you in a different mode or different format? So we're really excited about, our first stab at podcasting and sharing, something that we're very, very passionate about, which is learning, growing, and improving at the pace of change.
Yeah, and I think we maybe on one of maybe our fourth or fifth episode, we've already got a whole bunch already lined up. We could do a podcast on how to do a podcast and a bit of our journey on that, because that's been a whirlwind. And just for the record, so the record states this as well. I did prefer the name The Rob and Rob Show. But I think the Learning Zone has a bit more of a ring to it, but also because of what the Learning Zone is. Uh, and the Learning Zone really comes from, that thing that you always keep saying around, how do we create islands of learning in a sea of performance? And what we found, a lot of people trying to unlock human potential, become better leaders, entrepreneurs, better fathers or mothers, is we often try and embed new habits and behaviors in high stakes situations when it matters. We do that at the expense of trying to do it in a learning zone, in a space where it's low stakes and mistakes are expected. And that's why so many people, really know what to do, but struggle to do it because we don't create enough space to discuss the experiments, to discuss the learnings in the low stakes environment. And that's really what this podcast is about, creating the space to discuss learnings, to discuss mistakes. So when we get to the performance zone, we can really be at our best and unlock that human potential.
I think it's such a key piece, Rob. And in the last year, we felt and experienced unprecedented change, and it's been so overwhelming. And when I think back and reflect on where we were this time last year, I was so overwhelmed and so anxious and so fearful of what this future could mean and how it would impact on me personally, impact my family, impact our businesses that we work for, and impact the South African economy. And we've elected to stay here. Many of our friends and colleagues have moved abroad, and we're so passionate about this country and its future and its potential. But having said that, is how are we ourselves showing up every day and being the best versions of ourselves and enabling ourselves to perform optimally, whilst it's just our brains feel like they're exploding because there's so much happening and we're experiencing change at unprecedented rates, that we'll probably reflect on 10 years from now and go, remember 2020 and what that year was like, and how
Yeah.
we had so much going on, and there was so much uncertainty and we couldn't predict anything, and how much we grew and how much we learned and how much we improved during that time. Because I think both of us can attest to the fact that we learned so much over the last year.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because we've really realized now that just being over a year, I think it's a year and 1 week since the pandemic entered our lives, and we've had quite a few, realizations. One of them being that we are never going back to normal, because this is not a blip in the radar. In the course of humanity, this is much more like our generation's World War II, with regards to the fact that the world can be defined as the moment before and after COVID entered our realms of existence. And when we reflect more on the pandemic, it's also been, a year of lockdowns and a year of being stuck at home. And something we really want to talk about just at the start of this season of the podcast series is to reflect on what happened during lockdown for people, and really share some of what were some of the habits that unlocked performance for people. For most of us, we're just trying to stay alive, and that was a success for a lot of people. And I'm proud to say that me and you are mostly alive at this point. We're still clinging in there. But with the growing lockdowns around the world, there was a lot more of an emphasis on what are our daily habits, what can we do, how do we take care of ourselves, because it feels like our heads are exploding. And it was more than just baking bread and making ginger beer in our bathtubs, but what were the things that we could do not only to keep us sane, but to also help us thrive in times of these pandemics.
Exactly, and I think you've touched on a number of things. Is so many people felt so overwhelmed and didn't know where to start in relation to being the best versions of themselves. And really, what we want to touch on today is what are some of the key habits and experiences we've had, not only in ourselves, in the faults we've made, but also what we've heard in business from our clients, and what the employees that our learning and organizational development heads have had to acknowledge and have had to focus on intently. And I think back to my initial stages of lockdown and in the early stages of the pandemic in South Africa. I was by no means performing optimally. I was, really, really immersing myself in the detail, trying to figure out which levers to pull on. I didn't necessarily focus on bringing in my team and acknowledging their input and how they could support me with the things I was struggling with. It's very much get things done, move the needle on the things that are most important and I need to prioritize. I kind of distanced myself from important things which enabled me to be better. Wasn't necessarily, engaging with my family as much as I should have. I'm spending quality time with my son, who demanded that of me while he was stuck at home, and just trying to figure it out and make sense in this world. And I think you can share a lot around what was happening in our brains, Rob, during the initial stages of this pandemic.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we don't think about all the time, right? We rush so much to understand the algorithms, the financial models and markets, and which best piece of tech we can use to be more productive. Is it Trello? Is it Fellow? Is it MS Teams? Is it Zoom? What are the different things I can use to be more productive? What's the different technology I can use or best optimize? But there's also that technology between the ears, that computer between the ears, that brain that's driving it all. And what for a lot of us, what we didn't really, consciously talk about enough was that our brains felt like they were exploding. And that's because they kind of were. You know, if we just, take a step back to appreciate what the brain does, the brain is the most important organ in the body, according to the brain. That's my that's my lame dad joke for for this episode. I'll try to do one every episode as a new commitment. But put seriously, the brain's designed to keep us alive, to mitigate and manage threats, and that's essentially what the brain was doing. The brain is scanning our environment for threats, and there are different threat triggers that the brain is very sensitive to. Things like certainty, things like autonomy, things like relatedness. And these were triggers that were being set off during the pandemic. We have no certainty, and our brain kicks into a fight or flight mode as a result, which is often our worst thinking. We don't prioritize our best thinking, and our cognitive resources aren't really available to us in the way that we'd like them to be. And too often than not, we assume the worst. It's the same reason when you walk past a bush that's rustling next to you, you don't wait to see, is it the snake? Is it the wind? You assume it's a snake or something bad. And that's the natural functioning of the brain. But that also plays out when you don't know how COVID is transmitted. Is it in the air? Is it by touching door handles? Is it by food? We don't really know. So it's safer to close the whole economy down. And hopefully we'll be getting more certainty with the vaccine, and we'll be able to really manage things the best way we can. But because of that, our brain was in a fight or flight mode. They can get me out of here, running by emotions, assumptions, bias, not our best thinking. And now at the same vein, people are thinking how to take care of myself. It's almost
Yeah.
like we were doomed to fail in a way because our brains were in this threat state. We didn't have access to our best thinking or great capacity. But now we're trying to build these habits that are going to help us take care of ourselves.
Yeah, I think you touched on something so key, and I can attest to the fact that that was my biggest fault and flaw in relation to not only what we tell our clients, but I wasn't displaying it myself. Is that certainty trigger is I was in such a threat state because I couldn't predict anything. And, certainty is a measure of, can you predict future events? And we as individuals are constantly looking to predict the future and what will be, in relation to our financial wellness and our financial well-being, in relation to our family's well-being and longevity and health. And so, I saw the downside in my inability to predict future events all the time. And I was getting into more of a downward spiral in relation to seeing the downside, or glass half empty rather than glass half full, and not acknowledging that, the world is changing at such a rapid rate, and we're going to have many other challenging instances in our life's experiences. And how do we gear ourselves up for those challenges and make ourselves aware of how we can grow, develop, and improve in the face of them? Because, I think we can now, looking back on the last year, as I said earlier, we as individuals and in the organization we work with, we've improved and progressed far more in the last year than we would have had COVID not occurred. And I think that's really empowering for many people if they look back on what's happened developmentally in themselves. I think you've touched on something so key, is our brain was seeing the downside, because that's the natural wiring of the brain, to see the downside of COVID and this pandemic, to go, oh goodness, what does this really mean for me, and how am I going to navigate all of this? And it was just a crazy time.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for people really to reflect on and take on, is that the future is hard to predict. I think, as we've known for many years, and most recently in the last few years, and the disruption and the VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, is really becoming a state of being. And 2021 looks to be the same, if not more disruptive than last year. I would say one common theme: we're reaching the end of Q1 now in 2021, and all the clients we've worked with across South Africa and Africa have really said to us that we didn't have a good December holiday. No one is feeling recharged and replenished. And if anything, there's been an emotional hangover, or like a compounding sense of grief and loss that's starting to kick in for people mentally and emotionally. And we've seen that with regards to people placing much more emphasis on well-being, hiring chief well-being officers if they can, and if not, diverting all resources towards well-being as a starting point for this year. Because care of self is going to become the new wealth that's going to make us more resilient, as it is inevitable that there'll be more disruption throughout this year as well.
Yeah, and I think, if we talk about the neuroscience, Rob, you spoke about, the brain's instinctual response to change is that there's 5 times more real estate in the human brain for threat than there is for reward, meaning we're more likely to see the downside of change than seeing the upside. And if we're conscious of that, how do we reframe things to be more positively, focused and motivated in the face of change? I think you spoke a lot about certainty and what's happening in people's brains, but I think we should also share a little bit around what we know through our neuroscience research is happening in the brain around people's drivers for autonomy and for relatedness. And I think for myself, another 2 key drivers where I was more in a threat state in my response to what was happening than a reward state, because I crave autonomy, a sense of control in relation to my future, a sense of control in relation to my social context, a sense of control in relation to the business I lead. But that control in many instances was just, swept beneath me and taken away, in the sense of clients going, we don't know how severe this pandemic is going to be. We're not sure how much money we can spend, and we're going to take a holding view, within our business, going, what do we need to do to manage, our cost base, and what are we looking to do differently in relation to how we consider the longevity of the business? And then in the relatedness piece that you spoke of, I think there's so many levers there to pull. Is in being so overwhelmed and so anxious and concerned about what was happening during this crazy year, is we are social beings instinctively, and we crave social inclusion and social acceptance. Is I actually kind of moved away and isolated myself to some extent, other than my immediate family, and try to drill down on just performing optimally every day, to my own detriment, because I actually needed the support of my family and friends more so than ever. And I wasn't actually going out and seeking that support. I don't know what you experienced, but we spoke to our clients about it, but I did all the wrong things in all of those social drivers.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually a Greek word for it called crazier, and it's been studied for millennia, which it basically means that people know what to do, but they don't do it because there's a lack of mastery. And that that term has been known for literally centuries, which shows that it's not a new challenge, but it's a challenge we haven't quite mastered yet. And I think that's a big part of what we're going to discuss in the learning zone. I personally find myself being driven by my brain, not driving my own brain. What was really helpful was really asking the question: am I in a threat state? Do I have access to my best thinking? Am I being led by assumption here? I often found myself really trying to work really hard, work till 10, 11, getting emails on the weekend, feeling like I'm just pop open the computer and just sort out some stuff, and thinking that I was creating certainty for myself. I really reflect on it. I'm trying to create certainty that I'm doing well, I'm doing good, and realizing that I was burning myself out. And it was really hard because if you think about autonomy, the other part of that, again, rooted to survival. Because if I have certainty, I can predict outcomes. That means I can probably predict whether I'm going to survive or not. That's a good thing. If you don't have that, bing, 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 alarms go off, right? Another one of those is autonomy, a sense of control. Not only can I predict outcomes, but am I in control of those outcomes? And that was a big trigger for a lot of people. At least for me, can't go to gym, can't see people, can't shop where I want to shop, can't do the things that I want to do. And it became quite a downward spiral sometimes. I get getting really sad about it. Like what's really the point of anything, really, if we just can't do anything? And what's so interesting is that with the ability to reframe and creating more of a learning zone around it, sure, I don't have certainty, I don't have autonomy, but what am I certain of? What do I have control of? And that made me at least a lot more mindful of, scheduling my meals during the day when I was working from home. Now I'm working a bit more from the office. What am I really certain about? What can I look forward to as well with certainty? And that really became like a nice way to create a lot more control or certainty in our at least in my personal space, because I can't control the world and the global pandemic, but I can maybe spend a bit more effort being a bit more mindful in what I'm eating during the day, making healthy snacks, doing this and that. And I think, as you know, I actually lost about 5 kgs in the first few months. It may be a little bit of the stress, but I also think it was because I was eating more, but eating better at home, having that sense of control.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on such a key piece, is that, many people retracted and took on a bit of a victim mindset. We spoke of that downward spiral, and many people felt like they were alone in relation to how they were taking on the pandemic, in how they felt and the emotions that were playing out in inherently. And when people started to connect more and engage with others, I think the realization and what was uncovered was that they're not alone in dealing with what they're dealing with in this pandemic. And that's why irrelatedness is such a key driver in creating a reward response in the brain, where you're able to use the best parts of your brain. Is how within the pandemic, and we spoke to many clients about this, are you creating connected time and time to connect with those around you, to actually acknowledge that you're not the only person who's feeling anxious, who's feeling concerned, who's not feeling like they have any certainty in relation to what's happening in their world, and that they have minimal control than what they've had in the past. That this is not, you're not indifferent, or you're not different to anyone around you, that everyone's struggling with this. And how do we look for social support from those around us to help us overcome and navigate through this change. And as I said earlier, was the worst at that, in that I kind of withdrew and try to deal with it and manage it myself, in fear of not being vulnerable and not sharing with people that I was scared, I was anxious, I was apprehensive, but rather saying to people, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm dealing with, how are you guys doing, and what are you doing to overcome it? Because I think if many people were honest with themselves, we were all dealing with the same feelings. Whether you showed up as brave and courageous and resilient in the face of it, in the back end, you definitely were struggling with some things at differing levels, but you were struggling with many of the same things we all were.
Yeah, and I think that's really an interesting one as well, because what we found going to 2021 is that strategy is not going to fly.
Yeah.
We can't keep putting on that mask. I mean, mainly, well, our face masks, sure, that cover our nose, but the emotional mask, let me say that. We can't keep wearing that emotional mask, because it's actually draining cognitive capacity. And if we really want to, use habits to unlock performance and unlock human potential, we're going to have to change things up. And it can't be using limited brain resources trying to put on a brave face all the time. I think we need to do it for our family and as leaders sometimes. But there's also a lot of power in the vulnerability, and that can be another power tool to unlocking that relatedness, that sense of in-group as well. We mentioned a little bit, but I think we'll do a bit more throughout this season around understanding the power of the social brain. But put very simply, we're wired to connect. It's part of our basic biology. That's why it hurts so much when you get left out of a meeting or left out of a wedding invite you thought you should have gotten. Not talking personally here, I'm talking about someone else. I'm fine.
You
But
never know. You always invited, Aaron. I mean,
always,
you're at
always.
weddings every weekend.
That's it. That's it. I feel fine. I feel fine. But interestingly enough, there's a part of the brain that lights up with physical pain and social distress. It's the same. So it's interpreted with the same veracity as physical pain. That's how important it is to feel connected, to feel part of the herd, and to feel in the in group, to build that sense of relatedness. And we actually have a unique opportunity now, because the workplace is getting more human, we're getting more vulnerable, and we can build that better sense of relatedness as well. And I think that's some of the stuff that we've been experimenting with, and also a big part of experimenting in the learning zone as well.
Excellent, Rob. And I think so. So what we've spoken about, I think you've heard some of the things that you should focus on intently, particularly as we move into the balance of this year, 2021, and we're trying to make sense of, with the vaccination being administered across the country, how much longer is it going to last? When can we get back to some normalcy, and what that will look like? But simply put, I think what Rob's touched on there is very, very powerful. Is control what you can control. Let's look at ourselves intrinsically and put in daily rituals, habits, and behaviors that enable you to learn, grow, and improve, and then perform optimally. And as Rob's mentioned, is the three, through the research that we've been exposed to, speaks to communicating as much as possible. That certainty, creating as much clarity and certainty within your environment and context as you possibly can. The second is controlling what you can control, and not taking on a victim mindset around what's happening around you. What is it that you have control of, and what can you take initiative in relation to controlling things that you can, and applying yourself as best as possible in those areas. And then lastly, Rob, you spoke about relatedness, is intentionally creating time to connect with family, with close friends, or with anyone within your social sphere, to converse, to share openly, to share ideas, share stories, and just to really understand that you're not in isolation and you're not in your own in grappling with this crazy world we live in. Everyone's grappling with things in a different way. And how do we support each other? To actively try and support one another and lend a helping hand to anyone who's in need, because we all need help and we're all struggling with different things. I don't know what you think, Rob, but I think it's very, very key as we navigate this crazy world. And we're planning on sharing some really insightful tools and tips in our subsequent recordings coming up.
Yeah, I think for me, you've really summarized it well around how can we build more certainty, be able to predict our outcomes or what we can predict, focus our attention on that, focus our attention on what we can control, and build more intentional relatedness or in groups within our own in groups as well, with regards to that human connection. I think also just from my side, it also will be a theme that will pull out in the entire of season 1, is also to reflect on, are you leading your brain, or are you being led by your brain? Because there's a lot about that computer between the ears we don't really know so much just yet. And that's really a big passion around why we've started this, to really share a bit of that understanding that can hopefully unlock human potential in the learning zone.
Excellent. And so our first recording done, Rob. We still learning, we still trying to improve, and we would love all of everyone who's listening to this down the line, or will listen to it in the future, to give us feedback. All of our recordings and our podcasts will be launching a weekly episode, and we'd love your feedback on Apple iTunes and on Spotify, whatever that feedback may be, because we're trying to get better, we're trying to improve, but we're also trying to share as much of our knowledge and our experience, and where we're trying to improve ourselves, so that we can maybe support you during this crazy and disruptive world that we're living in.
I look forward to embarking on the journey with you and the rest of our listeners.
Ciao, everyone.